Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from. And welcome to the next in Protecht's webinar series. And today we're going to be talking about vendor risk management and how you can really get ahead of vendor risks. One thing we find is that sometimes vendor risk or third-party risk management can be quite a tick-the-box exercise, something that people think they just have to do. So today we're going to explore how you can add more value through your vendor risk management and third-party risk management. Now, joining me today, I have Jared Siddle. Jared, would you like to give a quick introduction before we jump into today's session?
Sure. Hello, everybody. My name is Jared Siddle. I'm a 3 times Chief Risk Officer, and I'm the Chief Customs Delivery Officer for North America.
And my name is Michael Howell. I'm the Head of Risk Research and Knowledge at Protecht. As the title probably implies, a bit of a risk nerd. And both Jared and I are working on how we can help our customers through better risk products. So a bit more about who Protecht is. We've been around for over 20 years. Was co-founded by 2 ex-chief risk officers, wondering how they could do risk better. And so one of the fruits of their labours is Protecht ERM, our flagship product, which is our enterprise risk management or GRC software, covering all of your enterprise risk management needs, from risk management, compliance management, business continuity, operational resilience, and of course, third-party risk management, and many more. So what we think makes us different is that we are built by risk experts. So as Jared and I have both highlighted, we come from a risk background, as do many other people at Protecht. Now this is borne out by our strong customer relationships because we understand our customers. And as you can see, we have a 97% customer retention rate, which is a world-class statistic. So in terms of today, we're going to run for around about 60 minutes, about 5 minutes for our introduction, which we're running through now. We'll run through about 45 minutes for our presentation and then end with some conclusions. Now on the way through, please add any comments, questions that you have into the questions chat bot, and we will answer those questions as a blog after the webinar has concluded. Now at the end of the webinar, we'd love you to stay online for a couple of minutes just to complete a questionnaire. This helps us understand how well we did today, what you liked, what you don't like, and what you'd like to see in the future. Always helps us develop amazing content for you. And as always, we will provide the slides and the recording. They will be made available to you after the session, and you can then perhaps share them with your colleagues if you see something that might be of interest to them as well. Now, in terms of the agenda for today, we're going to cover the scope and drivers of vendor risk management. Why is it becoming so much more important in today's environment? We'll explore some of the key vendor risks that you might need to consider and think about. Then we'll leverage that into how you can implement a strong vendor risk management process. Now, one of the keys here is understanding the roles and governance. Who needs to take part in some of the activities related to managing your vendor risks? And then we'll close out by bringing all of that stuff together for you. So let's start with the scope and drivers of vendor risk management. And we talk about enterprise risk and enterprise risk management, but we also include the extended enterprise, because all of our organizations can't live alone. We have many third parties that supply us with special services that we can't deliver ourselves or can't develop the in-house knowledge. Some of the organizations that we work with will have deep experience in a particular area that we can leverage, that we couldn't use ourselves. Now, this can come through third parties, those that we directly deal with, but those third parties also have their own third parties. I think there's a statistic of something like 50 times the amount of third parties you have is the number of fourth parties or nth parties that you have. So this is an illustration of what probably a very simple network could look like from a third party risk management perspective. Now, interestingly, when it comes to third parties, 73% of companies had a third party related incident in the last 3 years, according to a KPMG report. So it's not just cyber incidents or breaches within your own organization, but many of them will come through those third parties simply because of the large number of relationships that you have with them. And related to that is this cost of breaches. Breaches that come through a third party cost a lot more to remediate because there's a lot more backwards and forwards and a lot more effort that needs to go into resolving that with that third party. Now, Jared, so this extended enterprise can, for many organizations, cross jurisdictional boundaries. So do you want to cover a little bit about the regulatory landscape that we might be looking at?
Yes, certainly, and thanks, Michael. I think what you'll see here is a patchwork quilt of regulations and how they're being used and how they're being applied across the globe. If we turn to sort of like overall, the increase of the regulation is across the expectations from regulators around the improvements needed in third-party and fourth-party relationships. The interagency or the US regulators, the Fed, the OCC and the FDIC came out in 2023 with their replacement of the operational risk requirements. As well as we have the NIST requirements 800 and 161, which is on cyber supply chain management, which really shows the interconnectedness. I think we had COVID. We've seen that there were gaps that were being highlighted by regulators as opposed to some of those events that have taken place. Canada, they've also updated their B10, so which is the OSCE guidance for operational risk management, but in this case, also looking at resiliency guidelines. So that's important to think about differences from their perspective and how third-party risk management is being performed from their side. If we cross the pond then and look at EU and DORA, so the Digital Operational Resiliency Act, this is effective from January 25 and really has the emphasis on information communication technology and cybersecurity, but looking at like frameworks for ICT risk, third party with strict liability requirements, and then oversight for critical service providers. And I'll just repeat that again, critical service providers. That's important for them to understand who they are and who they are by they are from as well as fourth party incident reporting and their digital operational resiliency testing. Europe also has and I can only, I'll go through them, and if I get the number of Ds incorrect, the number of directives, but it's the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive and the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive. These really look at value chains and then look at impacts, risks, opportunities across value, supply chains. So again, a different perhaps sort of like viewpoint and perspective, but gives an interesting aspect around looking at double materiality. The one where it could be looking at the organisation and its auditing capability, and the second is the environment from reviewing them from a sustainability perspective. These directives give mandatory due diligence requirements, along with all clauses that must be in compliance for CSDDD compliance. With the UK, the PRA and the FCA, they have obviously enforced in outsourcing and third-party risk management requirements for some time now, but they've also upped their game. And they've also then now looking at critical third parties regime, which aligns with DORA, but looking at proving again resiliency, particularly in the financial sector, for looking at systemic risks that may impact the markets there overall. So these include materiality of services, concentration of services. Now, I may get this wrong, sub-sustainability or substituting for their services as well. And the regulator expects their firms to understand critical fourth party dependencies and ensure their third parties have adequate controls over their subcontractors. So that's their expectations. But Michael, let's hand the baton to you. What about from Australia perspective?
Yeah, so CS230 has just come to effect from the first by APRA to manage their material service providers. So these are the ones that support their critical operations, those that are going to have the most impact on external stakeholders. So there's a requirement for them to have policies in place, have risk management frameworks in place, also some contractual clauses that need to be in place with those defined material service providers, including step-in risk. So APRA can step in, if there is a major issue with some of these providers. Now, they do also need to report this material service provider register, needs to be provided to APRA. And there is also a requirement to track those fourth parties. So there is some similarities there with those critical service provider rules coming out of the UK, but one of the distinctions is that an entity must define their material service providers. APRA does not define them for them, but they do need to report them to APRA. Whereas in the UK, they're looking to define, the regulator's looking to define who is the critical service providers to the whole sector. So just an interesting, distinction between those two. One other thing I might pick up on, Jared, is, modern slavery is sort of under review at the moment in Australia. And similar to the CSRD and CSDDD is moving from just disclosure and reporting to potentially moving towards, making sure there is actual due diligence in place, not just that you're disclosing what your practices are, but that you're actually managing the risk. So I think that's an important shift that we're seeing across this global regulatory landscape. But some of the other drivers that we're seeing that drive this need to manage vendors and third parties effectively.
Yeah, certainly. Geopolitics comes certainly front to mind at the moment. I'm based in the US at the moment, so trade wars and protectionism come to mind, along with even sanctions and embargoes that are happening to countries and states as well. It always seems as though we live in an unstable world, but political instability and the conflict with regards to sort of like sovereigns or jurisdictional conflicts can take place. And those also relate to even like countries where data or residents, as well as then for privacy laws as well. Those can vary enormously between China, for example, and say the GDPR rules from that perspective. And then obviously there's national security concerns around state-sponsored cyber threats as well. So the geopolitical space is dynamic, it's moving. We've seen events that have taken place across the world with 25% of global oil and 20% of LNG that passes through the Strait of Hormuz. When the Iranian issues that are happening recently, those can cause potential issues there, as well as then looking at China had imposed like licensing restrictions on the 7 rare earth minerals that are taking place, and that's obviously vital for obviously some of the leading semiconductors and other defense and organizations from that perspective. Touching on technology, though, that then leads us to perhaps like AI, really, and the proliferation of AI is now in tools that are used across in products and services globally. But how do we know? Do we know how the data is being used? Where is it being sent? And how do we know it's safe? So those questions are probably questions you may be needing to ask yourself for your organization if you're using AI at the moment. The other area maybe to think about, and this is probably a little bit more personal to home, is around having vendor manual processes. So really in the past, I've experienced and had to use sort of like inefficient, time consuming, lack of scalability. They had human error with them in terms of inconsistency or potentially like visibility around real-time monitoring. And that was by using like spreadsheets. So manual processes being used there. Data sits in emails, so it's silo information and with a lack of integration, and not really having these more like point solutions rather than connected to the broader enterprise risk management capabilities. So those are certainly some on the basic scale as well, Michael. So just to call out those points.
Yeah, thanks, Joe. And I think we've both waxed lyrical offline about these manual processes. Both been involved in some of those. So yes, I can definitely agree with having many spreadsheets. Individual spreadsheets for each individual vendor is quite a challenge to wrangle, for sure.
Absolutely.
So what I'd like to do now is just explore some of the vendor risks that you might face. We'll dive a little bit deeper into a couple of those. But first, let's just really talk about what is it that we're really talking about. Let's define, when we say vendor risk management, what is it that we really mean? So if we take the key definition of risk from ISO 31000, which is the effect of uncertainty on objectives. And who is a third party? A third party is a person involved in addition to the two main people involved. So usually that's going to be you and your customer, and then you need these third parties in order to be able to provide your services. So third party risk is therefore the effect of uncertainty on our objectives that can arise from those third parties. Therefore, third-party risk management is the management of the risks that can originate from those third parties that may affect our organization's objectives. Now, we can see two ways that you can consider vendor risk, and that is vendors as a cause of a risk or vendor as a risk event in and of itself. So let's have a look at what those two might look like and the way it might frame the way you think about your vendors. So in this basic bow tie that we've built here, we've got a fall from height, and one of the key causes is that there might be a manufactured defect in the ladder that we're using to climb to this height. Now, we might consider that the manufacturer defect is something that's outside of our control and therefore is the end of our bow tie, the start of the life cycle of risk for us in this particular circumstance. Now, the thing is, vendors are to a degree within your control. They're a little bit at arm's length, but there is some level of control that you do have over your vendors, which then brings us to having a vendor as a risk event in and of itself. So it might be a little bit small to make out here, but third-party failure or third parties not supplying the services that they agreed to. They're using our typical risk bow tie methodology. We can ask the question, but well, why might they fail? And we can move backwards as to why they might fail until we get to those root causes. We can then move forward and say, what will the impact be if that event does happen? So if there is a non-failure or a failure of our third party, we then have potential failure eventually on our own objectives. Now, there is a dividing line here where everything to the left is something that happens at the third party. And everything to the right is what happens to us. Now, we can then add on controls to our bow tie, but some of those controls are over the third party or what happens at the third party. So things like upfront due diligence, having service level agreements, they're controls that we own, but they manage that side of the third party risk. We also then have other controls that we can put in place in our own organization to manage the impacts. In this case, we've got substitutes, quality control checks, inventory buffer, for example, to cater to some of those failures. So in this way, you can consider third parties as a risk event. So Jared, I just want to throw to you now for third party being considered a risk event, but how does it tie into all the other risks that our organizations face?
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Michael, because I think as we said, it's vendor risk is an enterprise risk. It touches upon virtually every area of your organization and your risk taxonomies as well. Strategic risk being one, just to call out to begin with. So critical third-party fails, maybe a cloud provider fails from a prolonged outage, or it prevents you from delivering your strategic objectives, such as launching a new product. This actually happened to me in an organization I worked for, where the third party did actually fail. It was Knight Capital. It had a model error. It failed, and then there was a lack of market capability. We had to then immediately move into our contingency around then utilizing our second provider, but just brings into the need to making sure if you're using the providers that they can impact your strategic goals, because it did delay the project as a result of that particular vendor failing. Operational is obviously the most obvious link where third parties can spend sort of like widespread disruptions to core processes. And we'll talk a little bit further about these and compliance as well and non-compliance aspects. Information security is often highlighted here as well, around third parties being increasingly the weakest link in your vendors from a vendor system perspective, because they may have access to sensitive data or to networks, and incidents such as solar winds come to mind here, where it compromised particular organizations. There are financial risks as well, credit risk being one of those. So perhaps looking at the monitoring of the viability of the third party you're looking at may be of interest. And we're going to talk about contagion and some really perhaps some interesting cases there that have either happened in the past as well to bring forward around. I remember Nike in the 1990s, they had a real issue with social media and also ethical lapses that were taking place at their third parties and their lack of oversight of those. So I think overall, Michael, I'd say vendors touch all risks. The key risks when focusing in on the vendor risk can include sort of like cybersecurity, and we'll talk about the 5 C's in a moment: data protection, the critical providers, as we mentioned earlier, just going back to their needs and for resiliency, just being clear on that. The ESG elements, and Michael touched also on those areas, as well as ethical practices and the concentration and the financial viability. So I've seen up the 5 C's. Let's just quickly talk about those in terms of running through them. And you never know, for risks, they're trying to come up with a new name. We've got the 5 C's here, but it could be 27 C's. I don't know. We'll have to think about this, Michael. Between the two of us, we can come up with some more lists of C's for risks. The first is around compliance, and then we'll hand over to Michael to talk a little bit about compliance. But we have cyber, concentration, contagion, and continuity, and we'll go through all 5 just now.
Thanks, Jared. So compliance, I think, can arise through third parties, or compliance risks or compliance breaches can arise through third parties in a few different ways. So the 2 main types that I see is that we can breach our own obligations via those vendors. So you might outsource an activity to a vendor who then needs to complete that task and the related compliance obligations on your behalf. Now, as an example, perhaps you have someone who's doing anti-money laundering checks or credit checks, identity checks, that type of thing, that you outsource to someone who is a specialist in that particular activity. But you can outsource the activity, but you can't outsource the risk. So that is one way in which that can happen. You have regulatory obligations or contractual obligations to someone else that are applied to your organization, and then you pass them on to that particular vendor. So they are required to complete them. Doesn't mean 100% of the time they will. There could be a breach that then does come back to you because you own that obligation. So those are direct compliance breaches. But there are also compliance breaches over the management of vendors. We went through some of those regulatory requirements or changes that are shifting. For example, I mentioned CPS 230 and the requirement to manage your third parties. So it's not about the individual vendor, but are you doing that process of managing those third parties? That is the obligation that you might be breaching. This also applies to things like modern slavery across various regions, where you have a regulatory obligation to map or manage modern slavery or related requirements across all of your supply chains. So it's not about just the breaches of an individual vendor, but are you breaching your obligations to manage that particular type of risk? So one I'm going to focus on now is cyber, and perhaps a note here is that cyber is sometimes synonymous with third-party risk management. Sometimes we see that IT teams might own third-party risk management because it is so prolific. Now, we think it is an enterprise risk approach. It should be something that covers all the different types of risks that your vendors bring, but it might be where one of the biggest focus areas. Now, when it comes to cyber, again, we're using our classic bow tie to think about a cyber intrusion. So we can think about this cyber intrusion as being for our own organization, with all of those causes on the left, including all the controls to manage them on the left. If we're talking about all of our own assets and all of our own capability. But we can put a dividing line between this to say that the cyber intrusion might happen at the third party and then flow onto us. Their cyber intrusion might then lead to compromise of our own systems and the ongoing data breaches and the eventual impacts on our objectives. So it's highly important that we manage those particular cyber risks because they can be so prolific. As we mentioned, there are so many third parties that all of our organizations have. And I would say that the lion's share of those are going to be technology providers of some sort. So this can include, your infrastructure, managed services. You have a lot of, probably a lot of technology tools, SaaS tools. You have many different pieces of software and technology that you are using as part of your organization that can increase the attack vectors or attack space across the organization. Yeah. So that covers compliance and cyber as 2 of the biggest ones, but thinking more about not just the individual providers, Jared, do you want to touch on concentration risk?
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting when you start to get into concentration risk. The key bit, for example, you could see them as perhaps a single point failure or non-performance of that third party can really impact you. You can then, that sometimes comes up projects or programs or otherwise in the past that I've used and seen where you can just look to identify those. But sometimes you can get an over sort of like a group sort of concentration, an over reliance on multiple third parties that may be part of the same global group. Their organizations now, the big tech companies now have multiple different offerings that they provide, and either shifts in strategic objection or disruption at the group level can have a significant impact to organizations. Then we have the geographic concentration, over-reliance on multiple independent service providers, but they all be operating in the same region. So Silicon Valley may be an example here, or you need to then have regional disruption can take place and then have an an impact on a significant impact on them or multiple providers as well. And finally, it's maybe then around systemic concentration, risk arising from specific third parties or geographies to services to a particular sector. And again, those can be significant and widespread, and and over leveraging from that perspective with multiple banks failing. So let's look at maybe perhaps a little bit further in detail. Maybe Michael, you could provide an example, run through systemic concentration risk a little bit further.
Yeah, sure. So I want to use an example of 6 banks just as a starting point. If you have these 6 banks all provide perhaps similar services, and they might have providers that support that particular service. So they might be considered critical providers, each of themselves, but they're all different providers, all providing a very similar service to multiple banks. Now, each of those critical providers might also have a common provider. So this is where we're getting not just to third-party risk, but fourth-party risk. So they might all rely on this same cloud provider. Now, if that cloud provider should fail, well, all 6 banks, at least for that particular process, will also fail. They'll fail to be able to deliver that process, that critical operation, important business service. Now, I'm using banks here as the example, but it can be any type of organization, just for the sake of illustration. Part of this map is that I'm presenting here to you as something you can see all of these parts. But if you take the viewpoint of any one of these, you can't see that whole picture. The bank knows their critical provider, maybe by virtue of questions about what parties they know who the cloud provider is, but they're not going to know who all the other banks are. They're not going to know who all the other critical providers are. And the cloud provider might not know all the banks that they serve ultimately at the end of that chain. And so I think this is where things like CPS 230, the UK's critical service provider rules, are going to start coming into play a little bit more in those particular sectors, where they're going to be looking a bit more of who are these cloud providers in this example. That's probably one of the most common, but there's obviously going to be many others as well. So it's understanding that this concentration exists, even if it's very difficult for people to solve for. I think it'll get better. We're going to touch on fourth-party reporting a little bit later. But yeah, I think it's a really interesting problem to solve, and I don't know that anyone's really solved it yet.
I love this, Michael. It's really like a dependency map, and then looking at sort of like trying to provide even gaps in regulation. I think that's why the regulators have jumped on this, but I think it's an excellent way of like digging into the detail that you actually really need to support your organisation.
So I'm going to move on now from concentration risk to contagion risk, our 4th C. Now, so this is the risk that the behaviour of the third parties, the vendors that you work with, they do something that is not a direct risk to your organisation, but by virtue of your proximity to them and their behaviours, the things that happen to them or the things that they do, perhaps critical leaders in the organisation might do something very public and have a poor reputational impact on that organisation, but it might also have an impact on reputation to your organisation as well, simply by virtue of the relationship that you have with them. Now, Jared, we've talked a little bit about this before. We've called it contagion risk because we don't define reputation risk as a risk in and of itself. We consider reputation an impact that can occur from many different types. There's that slight nuance there. You've been a chief risk officer multiple times. How are the conversations like this on reputation risk, contagion risk, how have they gone for you as far as managing that with third parties?
Yeah, I think you really need to know like adverse media or really understand the organisation. I can think of one company that we look to partner with, and culturally we were opposed in opposite ends to launching a new product. And to be honest, the product failed because both cultures were really were impacting one another from that perspective. But we also then had to reputationally then manage ourselves out to something that we publicly mentioned. So that was a difficult case, but one that we managed. But it's still something that shows when you are tied together, you really need to make sure you really understand the individuals, their ethical bias, and their behaviours and culturally how they operate. And I think that it shared to me that things can change as well, and you may need to react as well. So knowing what some of your triggers are as well, and being alerted to those around sort of like adverse media is also important as well from these type of things, because they can happen very quickly.
Yeah, awesome. And I think you've kind of touched on all of those key actions there, right? Is if you are going to have a relationship with another third party that's going to be quite public, make sure you're getting a benefit from that being that public. You might have a strategic partnership, you want to make a big announcement, have that be valuable to you if if things were to go bad. You've got that risk balance. So you reduce it if you don't need to. You might reduce some of those associations if there's not a benefit to doing so, and you'll sort of monitor some of those third parties. So I think you might talk about this a little bit later, Jared, but social scoring, or monitoring of their social media, monitoring of sentiment of the parties that are most critical to you, just so you can track what's happening for them that might be relevant to you related to contagion risk.
Absolutely.
So Jared, over to you for our 5th C, our final, which is continuity.
Continuity, yeah, exactly. Now here, many vendors support many critical processes, but it may not be clear, just like Michael just said around the systemic concentration, exactly where or how they're supporting you. And I think that's important to know. And now you do need to do that in terms of sort of like process mapping them, particularly in financial services. The regulators are requiring you to do that. So this sort of like simple visualization helps you understand where the third party is, and then helping you manage like what particular aspects of the process they'll be involved with, as well as the end-to-end risks. If you're not, then you're somewhat blind to them in terms of how they can impact you. So if we move on then to looking at the next section, we consider sort of are in place, and we'll go through the next slide. Really highlights the key processes that support an ERM framework. The inner ring shows the specific objectives. We have the risk taxonomy, and then we have the 7 stages here. So risk control, self-assessments, controls assurance, risk metrics and KRIs, incident management, issues and actions, compliance and change management. Those are uniform, but those are also uniform for third-party risk management as well. These common processes can still be typically used with just minor modification really to managing third-party risk management. And that's perhaps like an area to sort of focus in on, that is unified with your own ERM program and ERM framework. But let's perhaps dig into that maybe a little bit deeper, Michael. Should we dig into the VRM lifecycle and run through that next?
Yeah, absolutely. I think what you're saying here, Jared, is that these core processes, sometimes some of these individual use cases like third party, they do follow the same process, but there might be some little nuances that you might need to adapt. And so the key 3 phases of the VRM lifecycle is the initial onboarding phase, getting that vendor onboard in the first place, then ongoing monitoring. And we find this is an area that's not always done very well. Sometimes everything looks great in the onboarding phase, they get onboarded, and then people either drag their feet or the systems aren't in place to manage the risks that might change. So there might be a good risk assessment at the beginning, but then it might never be updated. It might be a one and done. And finally, offboarding. So once you've got all the benefits from the third-party relationship, it ends for whatever reason, either positive or negative, you need to be able to offboard those third parties effectively. So the reason that you bring a third party into your organization is because there's a reward for doing so. They help you deliver services, or they've got some way of helping your organization meet its objectives. Now that brings risk. It always does. But when they're offboarded, you don't want to stop getting the reward and have all the risk remain, because you might still hold data, or they still have access to your systems, or some of the other reputational impacts that might still occur. So you want to be able to manage those in that offboarding stage. I think one thing to note about that offboarding stage, particularly some of these steps, and I'll just walk through a couple of them, I'm not going to go deep into every single one today, but things like data cleaning, accessing access rights being terminated. You want to enforce those, which means that the steps in the offboarding phase need to be considered in the onboarding phase and during contract. To make sure that your contracts enable you to meet all the requirements that you expect during that offboarding phase. Now, during the onboarding phase, I'm going to cover initial tiering in a minute because that's one of my passions. But in the ongoing monitoring phase, a lot of the 7 processes that that Jared just mentioned are also part of this particular life cycle. You're going to be doing ongoing, which means controls assurance, controls management of either controls you have in place over the third party or getting assurance from them over their controls. You might define particular risk metrics over the vendor. You're going to have incident management processes that need to be in place. Now, these might integrate directly into your own enterprise risk management framework. So all of these same steps do exist. You may just need to integrate them as part of that particular process. Before I move on to initial tiering, because again, one of my passions, but do you have any here that you either want to focus on, have any tips for our audience, problems that you've seen in the past?
Yeah, no, thanks, Michael. Certainly the business case right up front is the piece with this onboarding. When you get to that go, no go is really that's been worked through and owned by the business or the vendor owner. With the first line, it's making sure that they really understood that and documented that and clearly it's articulated for everybody to sign on in the onboarding process. And it's sometimes the logjams in this process on the onboarding side as well. Legal and information security resources get completely tied up with trying to make sure the contract's correct and getting all the details that Michael's just mentioned in place. And then the information security team's got to either do the reviews or conduct reviews to make sure that the integrity is there with regards to the controls that we mentioned. So that certainly for me is on the onboarding side. The ongoing monitoring side is certainly holding those SLA meetings and really running through what you've seen, what you've observed, and really trying to make that more real time with real time data, either those be this cyber postures or scoring postures from expected, or as well as information to have those meetings to take place. And then you mentioned the offboarding is certainly knowing right at the beginning when you start on onboarding is knowing what the triggers are to do offboarding. Before you bring someone on, know what you're going to do to trigger them to turn them off. So those are a couple of my pieces, Michael.
Awesome. So I want to touch on this initial tiering, and I think one of the biggest takeaways I have is taking a risk-based approach to this onboarding or tiering. So one size fits all doesn't really work for third-party risk management or vendor risk management. If you throw 1,000 questions at every single vendor, as Jared said, you're going to be really bogged down in lots of administrative work that's not really adding a lot of value. So this is a particular approach that I found works quite well, is taking some very high-level key questions and asking these key questions to then define what further due diligence do I need to do. Financial, how much is the spend? Information security, that's obviously a critical one. Compliance, do they assist you with meeting some of your compliance obligations or otherwise might impact that? Business continuity, what happens if they fail? Strategic importance. Jared, you mentioned one of the failures that you had in one of your third parties that was a key strategic decision, right? So that should have, and maybe it did, but maybe up front that requires a bit more information on, well, what's our exit strategy? If this fails. And finally, the reputational. What's the profile of the relationship? So the answers to some of these questions then define both an overall perhaps assessment. We find some people use tiering like tier 1, 2, and 3, or some other categorization similar to that, but also then defines which types of questions and follow-ups that you might need to issue. If you've got a third party who has no access to any of your systems, you might not need to ask them any questions about their information security, or it might be very broad rather than being very detailed about specific systems and controls that they have in place. Same for business continuity. For some, you might only care that they have a business continuity program in place and that they can evidence that. But for some, especially if they're supporting your critical operations, you might want to have involvement in their testing process itself, or see the evidence of their tests, not just that they have a program. So the initial tiering is kind of like an inherent risk assessment to suggest what more effort do we need to put in for this particular arrangement. So, Jared, one of the things I guess from here is you know, how do you engage with the vendors in this process? You know, you might have vendors. How do we
Thanks, Michael. I think for me, it's clear communication channels. So really setting expectations from the outset, being transparent and open, and fostering that relation. That engenders sort of like the trust and the build of trust. But you're taking on this third party, you have to really understand them and also leverage technology to help you in automation to help you manage this relationship. Vendors don't typically complete tasks because they have no visibility. They might have multiple outstanding actions, but you don't know where they are, or they've been handled by different people. But a sort of like standard set of and a standard portal can help you really manage that problem. So it's a good communication flow that you can have between yourselves and others, and to understand where you can follow up internally and externally, as I mentioned, the legal and the information security team, or externally here with the vendors themselves. It's really fostering that sort of like greater understanding and transparency around what they are competing with, and then how you're going to be able to help yourself and your organization. From here, just sort of like Michael's mentioned a little bit around questionnaires, and this is another sort of like little bit for me. He touched on what's economical and what's appropriate. From my perspective in the past, has been you can use a set of questionnaires that could lead you down a little bit down a check the box type approach. So you have to be a little bit careful there, but also that they are a sort of like snapshot in time. So you may need to supplement these with feeds for intelligence or reassessment and ongoing comms I just mentioned. Help you understand where is this vendor, and then going back to Michael's point is what's their tiering. So use tiering, and the tiering can help you also with regards to obviously the significant number of questions you may ask to a high risk vendor to perhaps a lower number for a low risk vendor. Also, vendors can get to like fatigue for responding to all these questionnaires and assessments themselves. So maybe shared assessments can sometimes be helpful, or even verification or certification programs can be helpful in that space. I've often seen responses when they come back, they can have some biases in their results, and they perhaps need to really look at perhaps independent attestations, so SOC 2 or ISO certifications, or even external security ratings that really take away some of that bias that could potentially occur from that perspective. So those are sort of like the questionnaires are not, as it says here, are not a replacement for a risk assessment. I think those are vitally important, and that's what I always lean to from my perspective. But Michael, talk a little bit more about vendor management and then seeing and managing, overseeing that.
Yeah. So there's the questions that you send those individual vendors and some of the other activities, but you need to be able to look over all of those vendors to think about all the activities that are taking place. We're going to talk about centralization a bit later, but having that visibility is critical. As you said, some things can be in manual inboxes or email inboxes if they're not managed centrally, but then you lose, that portfolio picture. So, in this example, we can see sort of in the top right there, there's 8 findings that are higher extreme across this portfolio of vendors. So these are things that we might want to then dig into, perhaps at a executive level, committee level, to find out, well, where are some of these biggest gaps that are across our vendor profile. Helps us look at some of the individual activities that we need to be doing as an organization to manage these third parties, making sure that we are doing these risk assessments on time, are doing these due diligence processes, have all the questionnaires that we need, are following up on them as needed. So having a space to manage those vendors in a single place rather than being distributed across the organization, that makes it very difficult to look at. So this also brings us to reporting over vendor risk management. So being able to then think about some of those key risk categories, a lot of these are linked very closely to that initial tiering kind of approach that I mentioned. What are some of the reputational risks or operational? How many vendors do we have in each of those categories or tiers? So this can help us provide this oversight and then look into some of those individual vendors if we need to. We can look at the control effectiveness across all of those, figure out which particular vendors are perhaps bringing us the most risk, and how they're being managed effectively. Now, these data points consider some of the risks and controls across some of those individual vendors. But Jared, what about thinking about that portfolio of vendors?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense, Michael, from what you described. And I like the sort of like the aggregate vendor risk profile sort of like view. You can tie this to your own risk appetite as well. So you could use these thresholds where you're linking with strategic objectives and then to risk appetite, as well as then giving you these financial metrics or metrics that are not just financial but are also quantitative to help you sort of like manage the overall portfolio and help really sort of like identify any early warning issues that you may have across the various different risk types that we've talked through today. So the 5Cs, the strategic ones that I mentioned, controls assurance, all the way through to sort of like cyber security from that point of view. So this holistic portfolio view does give you a good view that you can then to your board and to your risk committees of how you stand and whether you're within their appetite. Also then on to the next slide is then really talking about fourth parties. You've got to keep an eye on these and looking out for sort of like external monitoring for fourth parties and being able to record those. So a place to really capture those is highlighted here, where you can actually then get to review them, to identify when those reviews are taking place, the security postures, the sentiment monitoring, sustainability and ESG results coming back on these actual fourth parties as well. So you can build up a greater picture to what Michael showed earlier around systemic issues as well, but the linkage between the third and the fourth party that gives you a better view and a deeper view into your the third parties that you're using.
So going down to some of the roles and governance of third-party risk management, vendor risk management. And I want to start with this centralized concept that I mentioned earlier. And we're seeing a shift more towards a centralized approach. So instead of individual departments each doing their own thing, having a centralized point to manage third-party risk management. Now, that doesn't mean that they are the ones doing all of the work, but it is a centralized point to coordinate. Now, there are different ways that it can be approached in different organizations, but we're seeing an increase up to 57% from previous years, but still continuing to trend upwards from from decentralized up to this centralized approach. Now we can see here, this is from an EY report, that the two biggest benefits on the bottom of that report is just better user experience. And Jared, you talked to being burdened by lots of administrative effort. It's just better user experience for the people in the organization if there's this centralized process. And second, of course, is that increased understanding of risks. So you're getting those two benefits. One that's more, I guess, performance-based and people just being happy about doing the job, while also managing your risks more effectively. On top of those others that are also listed here, such as cost savings and return on investment.
Yeah, this makes
so Jared,
sense,
do you want to talk
Michael.
through maybe some more of those roles that might be related to third-party risk management, vendor risk management?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that some of them does bring to the point about being a little bit more centralized, but there are many departments involved, and we've highlighted a few here. Each of these have their own particular case in terms of and views into the risks and roles and responsibilities that they're looking at. So they may have their own data repositories, their own information and methodologies that they're collecting, from the contracts in legal to the procurement as they race to try and get the closure with the finance team trying to then make sure that the J curves are meeting their capabilities and profitability when using these third parties. So it can be a multitude of individuals that are involved with different elements that they're focused on. So Michael mentioned around resiliency. So my previous team was actually doing the testing with vendors. So they would actually actively do those tests with vendors to make sure that they were meeting their objectives and work with their data centers as well. So it's really clear that you need to identify who the roles and responsibilities are. An important one is who owns the vendor. You've got all of these individuals involved, but who ultimately owns this vendor? And typically a vendor manager or someone, maybe if it's appropriate for the first line, but who's the vendor associated with, and making sure that's crystal clear as well is important. But there are also then joint accountabilities and responsibilities as well. So making sure that the roles are clear, and then the escalation criteria are clear. If there is an area where there may be an incident that needs to be raised, or an SLA is then not meeting requirements, that you're really making sure that you're pulling this information together. And that really needs you to lead to one source of truth, really then utilising the other departments with their roles and their data and making sure that's integrated, and then aggregating this information so it's available from existing systems. Well, is there anything I've missed, Michael, from roles, responsibilities and accountability?
No, I think you've captured it there. I think one thing more from that sort of practical day-to-day logistic perspective is things like questionnaires or internal assessments, is that different roles might do different assessments. So for example, some of the questionnaires might be issued from a centralized place, but then maybe when they come back, so examples might be information security type questionnaires, might then need to be vetted by, then other types of questions come back, might need to be assessed by someone else. Maybe there's a, a risk team that's responsible for business continuity. They might need to assess those responses, especially if, business continuity plans, policies, etc. are attached. So there is that level of coordination that I think needs to happen across those different roles. So I think you covered all the roles, but I think thinking then logistically how they fit together in a day-to-day process, which is can be challenging. So with that challenge in mind, let's look at how we then bring all of this together. So I'm going to bring back our enterprise risk management framework, and that risks should be managed consistently across the enterprise. So you shouldn't have a separate operational risk or enterprise risk management framework that then is completely fixed when it comes to third-party risk. You want to be using as much as possible the same frameworks, same methodologies, the same types of tools, and the same process. You have a definition of risk, should be the same definition whether it comes from a vendor or from your own organization. The same type of risk, so Jared mentioned all of the risks earlier when he walked through the risk taxonomy, those risks might arise from multiple sources. Sometimes they'll be internal and sometimes they'll be via third parties. So it doesn't really make sense to have the same risk duplicated in an enterprise system and then in a point solution for third party. They're all part of the same risk. Now, a lot of the data that we've covered, the different processes will produce a lot of data. Again, you want to use the same tools, the same types of data so that you can aggregate that all into an overall risk profile. So with that in mind, Jared, I'll hand over to you to talk through, how we can bring this together through some reporting.
Yeah, thanks, Michael. So risk is always in motion, as we say here at Protecht, and it's important to think about that then in the vendor life cycle that we've walked you through, and then the vendors themselves. So as Michael said, this is trying to give an aggregate view of where each of your vendors may lie, looking at both the questionnaires, either the responses open or closed in terms of overdue, but then across the other pillars here, risk assessments, the documentation that you've received, contracts or insurance documentations, actions where vendors are required, you've required them to provide you responses, issues or findings, or monitoring reviews or capabilities from looking at the actual activities themselves and ongoing. So you can think of an overall portfolio health score, but then you have an individual health score, then looking down each of your vendors both by tier, by criticality, by health score, and then they can be followed up in terms of by the vendor owner or the actual individual groups themselves through their own activities.
I love that. And I think if you're an executive, you can see at a glance, filter for the stuff that might be third parties that support your business unit and find out whether they're being managed effectively. And for those who are more in the oversight roles, can look at those key activities and see, is there a key activity that's just not being performed well across the board that we might need to improve? So allowing people to mature their own vendor risk management frameworks. Is that accurate?
That's absolutely spot on, Michael. No, that's it exactly. That's what we're trying to give with this particular view and dashboard for our clients. The next area is then getting into perhaps the nitty gritty. So let's get into where vendors and their actions, like following up or vendors, by time, by priority, by tiering, by due dates, trending, by criticality. These all give you a view around how all of your vendors are performing, but it also enables you to drill into each of these to say, who are my high risk ones, and then making sure that action's being performed. We want to see that action is taking place to make sure that you're mitigating risk and you're improving the organisation as well as the third party. So I don't know if there's any other questions you've got there, Michael. Otherwise, I thought we could talk about some other keys for success on the back of that.
Absolutely. So we've talked through some of these roles and responsibilities, but especially if you're looking to centralize third-party risk management, you need to get that board and executive buy-in to show them some of these benefits around third-party risk management or vendor risk management. You need to think about all those roles that are involved, make sure they're all coordinated, understand their needs in the particular process. So if someone just comes up with a process and says, here's your process, probably not going to work very well. The key to success is saying, how can we make this work better for you? What's not working now and what might need to change in order for this to work better for you? Clearly define ownership. We've covered that in a bit of detail. You've already got some practices in place. So it is about just continuing to improve those, with those key stakeholders. Think about how you're going to store data, how you're going to want that to look in the future, particularly when you think about reporting. So collect data now to support the future reporting and decisions that you need to make. Educate people on how they need to manage vendors more effectively, and of course have a robust and comprehensive approach to vendor risk management. I mentioned right back at the beginning that vendor risk management is not just cyber risk management or information security, it's about all the different types of risks that your vendors bring to your organization. So do you have any quick final conclusions, Jared, before we close out today's webinar?
Sure. It's a big topic. It's a big area. It touches all risks. I think that we've given some insight into some of the domains and ability to look at an aggregate portfolio perspective. And I think it's I love the process of Kaizen, so continuous improvement, and that's what you need to do in this space. And that's how this is. I think that the helpful automation and technology will help you improve on the decision making and helping everybody understand the risks involved with third-party vendors.
And I think my key takeaway, if there's only one thing that you do today, it's think about how you can tier your vendors if you're not already doing that, because I think that is the unlock for value very quickly.
Yeah.
So thank you for joining us today. A couple of final things. We do have some more resources around third-party risk management or vendor risk management. So you can jump over to look at how we deal with vendor risk management in Protecht ERM. We do have a product webinar that you can look at online. And we're also been a named vendor as a representative vendor, I should say, in Gartner's Market Guide for Third-Party Risk Management. So you can go and download that report also from our website for a limited time. So I'd like to thank all of you for joining us today. I'd like to thank Jared. You've been amazing. Thank you for helping me out today. And please stay online for the next 30 seconds or so, just so you can answer a final survey on how you found today's webinar and how we can keep improving in the future. Thanks, Jared, and thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Malcolm.